that early Christians, we're talking the first couple centuries, suggested possibly up to 4 probable dates. As early as the time of Claudius, the Emperor Claudius in the 40s and 50s, and as late as the Emperor Trajan in the early 2nd century, about the 110s. But essentially, in modern scholarship, it's boiled down to 2 dates, 2 probable dates. The first is sometimes referred to as the early date. In the mid-60s, around the time of the Emperor Nero. The second date is sometimes referred to as the late date, somewhere in the 90s, during the reign of the Emperor Domitian. So most would say it's a 1st century document, and we really can't go much beyond that date. But ultimately, of course, we're kind of presented with the case of, really, what does it matter? Does it matter at all whether it's the early date or the late date? It does in one sense, because of how the book is interpreted. And so there are some interpretations of the book of Revelation that require the early date. For example, people that think it's about the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of Jerusalem. Well, that took place in the 70s. Right? It took place AD 70. So if the book's written in the 90s, John's a little late. Right? It's already taken place. It's 20 years old. Right? And so it does affect how we interpret the document. Because if we can be certain it's the 90s, then we say it's probably not about the fall of Jerusalem. And so how we interpret some of the symbols, how we decide what the book is about, does sometimes depend on where we date it. Most Christians throughout history, until recently, within the past 100, 200 years, have favored the later date, have favored the belief that John wrote Revelation during the time of Domitian. And that has to do with some things like the persecution Christians were experiencing and some other things that seem to be more likely to have taken place in the later date. In more recent years, however, there has been more favor for the early date, as well as some scholars suggesting, is there a possibility that there's a combination of the two going on? Meaning that John saw these events, had these visions, experiences, sometime in the 60s, but then wrote them down or edited them in the 90s. Right? And so the experience occurred in the 60s, maybe pushing it into the 70s, but then finally written down in the 90s. Here too, of course, we kind of say, well, if he's editing it in the 90s or writing it down in the 90s, the likelihood that it's about, for example, the fall of Jerusalem really kind of decreases. What do people point to try and determine what these dates are? Well, those that favor the early date point to several references throughout the book, especially in chapter 11, where John talks about the temple and appears to be talking about an earthly temple in Jerusalem. So, they say, this has to be before the 70s. It has to be before AD 70 when the temple is destroyed, because John is referring to the temple. A second thing people point to try and say this is the date of Revelation, the early date, is a reference in chapter 17. In chapter 17, John sees the vision of a prostitute sitting on a huge red beast. The red beast has 7 heads. And John is told that those 7 heads represent 7 kings. 5 had fallen, 1 is, and 1 is to come. Right? And so during that 6th king is when John is experiencing revelation. And so they would say, taking a look at the 7 kings, you start with Julius Caesar, Augustus, Tiberius, Gaius, sometimes his nickname was Caligula, which means little boots. Right? Caligula was a fascinating individual. Yeah, he was. It was illegal to talk about goats in Caligula's presence. You couldn't talk about goats. And because he was balding, people were not allowed to look down on him from above. Right? And so nobody was allowed to be on the second floor if Caligula was on the first floor. Crazy, crazy guy. Tried to set up a statue to himself in the temple, which did not go over well with the Jews. So Caligula IV, Claudius V. So 5 have fallen. 1 is Nero, and 1 is coming. Right? And so that's the suggestion. Right? Caesar being kind of suggested as the first of the real kings of Rome, the emperors of Rome. A third thing that people point to say it's an early date are possible references in the letter of James and the letters of Peter. People point to references to a new heavens and new earth. They point to other references to say James and Peter seem to be dependent upon some things in Revelation. And since James and Peter both die in the 60s, it's likely that Revelation would have to have been written before then, putting the date in the 60s. The final piece of information people point to say this is an early date is some references by some early Christians after the New Testament suggesting that John had these experiences during the time of Nero. So those are essentially the 4 pieces of evidence that people appeal to say, this is why we should say it was sometime during the 60s. On the other hand, in support of the later date are a couple of things. First is the prevalence of emperor worship. Many passages in Revelation appear to refer to emperor worship and persecution related to it. Now, there was an emphasis on emperors being godlike before the time of Domitian. But Domitian really seems to be one of the first major ones to make this kind of a test of loyalty to the empire. And it appears from Roman historians that Domitian really emphasized being referred to as Lord and God. And so, out of those passages, people would say, so this really seems to be something new, and so it's likely that this is during the time of Domitian. Second is the passages that reference persecution. During the time of Domitian, Christians faced persecution for a variety of offenses against the emperor. It wasn't kind of like worldwide spread, but we do know of several people that appear to have been persecuted. And that persecution ranged from losing economic status to imprisonment and death. An early governor of the 2nd century, a man named Pliny, confirms that Domitian persecuted Christians from all classes, Christians that were citizens of Rome, people that were non-citizens of Rome. A third thing people point to suggest that that this is a later date document are the social conditions of the churches. These are churches, many of them are spiritually lax. They've lost their fervor, they're beginning to make accommodations to the culture around them, and so people supporting the late date would say there needs to be some time between when these churches are started and when Revelation is written. Another thing emphasized is that in the letter to the Laodiceans in chapter 3, Jesus refers to their wealth and their belief in their wealth, their pride in their wealth. But Laodicea had experienced an earthquake somewhere around 60-61 and took some time to be rebuilt. So the likelihood that wealth would have been there by a date in the mid-60s drops, suggesting that it's a later date than an earlier date. And then finally, an early Christian named Polycarp, who was a disciple of the Apostle John, claimed that the church at Smyrna, one of the 7 churches, had not been in existence in the time of the Apostle Paul, right, which would have been that 60s time. Right? And so all of these, they say, point to a later date. And then finally, there are also external references by Christians to say it was written by the time of Domitian. There are challenges to both dates. First of all, temple references don't have to refer to a literal temple in Revelation. There are several ways where you could interpret the temple passages as not referring to a literal temple. So that doesn't provide the evidence that it is a pre-70 date. A second problem comes back to those 7 kings talked about in Revelation chapter 17. Where do you start? The early date, people start with Julius Caesar. But Caesar really wasn't the first emperor of Rome. I mean, he tried to make some of those claims, but, he really wasn't a strong emperor of Rome, enough to suggest as king. So, should you start with Caesar, or should you start with the next guy, Augustus, who was actually the first Caesar, emperor, right? That we say, okay, yeah, he's a king. And so, the 5 have fallen, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. One is Galba, who succeeded Nero, and one is coming, Otho, and then there's one that comes after him, Vitellius. So do you start there with Augustus? Because that gives you a different date. Do you even change it around a bit? Because Galba, Otho, and Vitellius all were emperor within 1 year. Otho and Vitellius tried to be emperor at the same time, and all 3 of them met rather untimely ends. So, are they counted? Which means, should we rearrange it and say 5 have fallen, 1 is, who's Vespasian, who's the emperor, the emperor, really emperor after Vitellius, right? 1 is, during the time of Vespasian, and then the 1 coming is Titus, who's before Domitian, right? Which puts it at a different date. Do you start it with Tiberius, right, who is the first emperor once Christianity starts existing? Do you start it at Caligula, who is the first emperor to start persecuting Christians, although it's just kind of a minor persecution? So, depending on where you start it, you're going to end up with a different date. What other people have suggested as well is that the 7 kings of Revelation 17 are not 7 literal kings. So that raises a completely different issue when it comes to date. Right? So it's a 1st century date, but the 7 kings doesn't necessarily help us pin down is it the early date or the later date. Thirdly, the supposed conditions of the churches doesn't necessarily demonstrate that it has to be that later date. Perhaps Laodicea rebuilt quickly, or perhaps the Laodiceans who decided to rebuild without getting aid from the empire already kind of had this pretty smug conception of themselves. And so they're not completely rebuilt, they're just very prideful. Finally, when you look at the letter to the Galatians, one of the things that Paul is very quick to say very early on in that document is how quickly the Galatians have turned from his teaching to another gospel. So the fact that, or the belief that there needs to be this decades worth of time before churches start falling into this kind of spiritual apathy doesn't even have the support of the New Testament. We see some churches that fell into that pretty quickly. And then finally, if John is talking about some things related to Domitian, it doesn't mean that he necessarily saw it then. So he could have seen it during the time and experienced it during the time of Nero or the time of Vespasian, but it was related to things happening during the time of Domitian. So the date, there's a lot of things where we can say, well, I don't really know a specific date. We'll take up this a little bit more when we talk about interpretation here in a little bit. But what seems to be the most likely for right now is that it has to do with some things related to that later date. And so it may have been seen earlier, but probably has some things to do with that later date. Questions about dating? Anything I need to clarify? I mean, I might have confused you a little bit, so I want to make sure that. All right. Some things where there seems to be much more clarity about them. The occasion and the purpose. What seems to be going on, the reason the Revelation is written, is based on persecution of Christians. Now, the actual experience of those Christians is unclear. First century persecution of Christians, and even into the second century, was often very selective and not empire-wide. And so Rome sometimes faced, Christians in Rome sometimes faced persecution. I don't want to diminish it. The people in the area we're going to be talking about, right, Roman province of Asia, they experienced persecution at various times. But it wasn't this empire-wide persecution like we'd see in later decades. Furthermore, it's unclear, are they experiencing persecution now? Or is the message to say the limited persecution you're experiencing is going to begin intensifying? But it has to do with the persecution that's going on. Maybe suggesting to those Christians, you're not noticing what's going on. And especially with those Christians that appear to be making some accommodations to the culture around them. And you don't understand what's going on, and this is what's going to happen. A second part of the occasion, of course, is that John is in exile on Patmos, a small island off the coast of Asia Minor, modern-day Turkey. And so that's where John is, what he's experiencing when he has this vision. Additionally, there also appears not just kind of this comfort given to persecuted Christians, there's also this warning. Those Christians that are kind of lax in their spirituality, those that are kind of taking things for granted, making accommodations, they need to change their ways, according to Revelation. It's possible that they have been making compromises, that they have given in to some things in the larger culture. So, for example, if you wanted to be a member of a trade guild, and you were some sort of artisan, you would have been a part of a guild of fellow artisans, but those guilds would have had to have participated in feasts related to the patron deity of your guild, and many of those feasts would have taken place in temples. So as a Christian, you're faced with this decision. Do you go along with that, or do you find yourself outside of the trade guild? And so the concern is, what kind of compromises are you making with the culture around you? And then finally, it appears that there are several false teachers in several of these churches promoting a variety of doctrines about the relationship between churches and culture, Christians and culture. And so the purpose is to say, don't compromise. Don't compromise with those teachers. Don't compromise with that broader culture. You're going to experience persecution, but be comforted in that. And we'll see more of that as we go. Which leads us into the audience. Who is Revelation written to? Well, it's specifically written to 7 churches in the Roman province of Asia. And so it says Asia, but John is referring to, like I said, modern-day Turkey. Now, one of the questions, of course, would be, why these 7 churches? Because we do know there were other churches in Asia, in the Asian region. that existed. So why only these 7 and not to the other churches as well? Well, one could be, that these are the churches John is most acquainted with, which is why it's directed specifically to them. Another thing that has been suggested is that much like the uses of 7 throughout the rest of the book of Revelation, that the 7 churches of Asia are also symbolic. Right? The real churches, they existed, and this message went to them. But they also stand in for the church universal. Right? And so the message goes directly to 7 churches in the Roman province of Asia, but it's meant for all Christians at that time, and for all times, really. And each of these churches once we get into chapter 2 and 3 and start looking into letters, we'll talk about, who started these churches, what was going on, what's going on in the city, those kind of things. And so we'll explore the audience in more depth as we get into the text.